I love old-school horror games. In fact, I play them pretty regularly even to this day, while also keeping an eye on recent horror titles. And I realized long ago that these AAA horror games rarely carry on the nostalgic magic of the survival horror games of old. New horror games rarely, if ever, rely on things like fixed camera angles or tank controls, let alone 2D pixel art graphics, or, God forbid, some emphasis on actual resource management. So, where to turn when we, horror-loving retro gamers, want to experience the true horror in a more classic fashion? Well, this heavy burden was graciously taken upon the strong shoulders of awesome indie developers all over the world. They are true horror crusaders that simply won't let the old code die. So, elation and jubilation gamers from all around the world. I am Lucian, the World Gamer. Welcome to my show, where we explore the most obscure and less talked about topics in the world of gaming. And today, we will explore some of the best indie horror games that were influenced by famous franchises such as Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and even Clock Tower. So, without further ado, let's dive right in.
This is serious business.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this for so long.
Daymare 1998 is a survival horror that was born from the ashes of the Resident Evil 2 final remake from 2015, which managed to catch the attention of the whole gaming community. Of course, with Capcom announcing the official Resident Evil 2 remake, this fun project was shut down. But this allowed the people at Invader Studios to think about it and restart the project as a completely new IP, all with Capcom's blessing. If you wish to know more about the history and development of Daymare, check out my other video. You will find the link in the description and on the screen right now. Let me state it right away, if you're a fan of survival horror games, there's a lot to like here.
But let's get things in the right order.
Let's start with the graphics, and I have to say, for an indie game, this is certainly a looker. The graphics are seriously good and serve the moody atmosphere perfectly, making it look more like a AA production rather than your typical indie game.
How often does that happen?
I think Daymare gives its best graphically in closed spaces, with its oppressive atmosphere and the awareness that an enemy could attack you anytime.
Yeah, well, good luck with that.
In the open spaces, there are some hiccups with some popping up of distant objects, but at least the frame rate is still solid. Some other areas have highly detailed environment that hugely helps the immersion. In particular, the lighting effects are supremely crafted, and in combination with the creepy vibe, they make turning every corner an unnerving experience. One of my favorite areas is the small town early in the game. We have seen so many secret labs and hospitals, and they certainly are present in Daymare, but not so much of neighborhoods and houses. And especially the latter definitely felt like lived through, with the owners still in there, roaming around in their now zombified state. It is this attention to details that elevates the game to somewhat unexpected heights. To be honest, I think that it did an even better job at it than the Resident Evil 2 remake, and in some ways even the Resident Evil 3 remake.
You don't say.
The horrific monstrosities that populate the game don't look half bad either, especially from the design point of view. Some of them are really repulsively looking and move in a very unnatural way, even though a few times they can look more funny than scary. Like some drunken fellas that you will see on the streets on a Friday night.
How often does that happen?
One thing that bummed me a little is that the zombies' only way to attack is to grab and spit some acid on you. I mean, it's okay for once zombies don't bite you. It gives them more personality compared to the classic ones. I was just hoping for more variety in their attack patterns. Maybe also do like the Crimson Heads in the Resident Evil 1 remake, where they try to slash you with their claws. Also, they don't seem to be able of like grabbing your leg when they're down. On the other hand, they sometimes manage to grab you from a greater distance than you would think possible, right when you thought you were safe and out of zombies' arm's reach. So maybe I would have hoped on a better collision management, because you can lose health in very cheap ways this way.
That's unfortunate.
I wish there was also more variety among the enemy ranks, as most of them are humanoid, so no zombie dogs or stuff like that. But again, considering the scale of the project, I'm just glad they focused on fewer enemies done good, rather than many enemies done bad.
No, you're right.
Anyway, the zombies themselves still look pretty different from one another, and in this case they are the main type of enemies, so again, in the end, I'm pretty satisfied with the results. So yeah, while the monsters all look good, the same can't really be said for the facial animations of the human characters. The best result is with Liv, the hunk of the situation, because he's wearing a mask most of the time, making it so much simpler to render because there isn't really a lot to animate face-wise.
Who would have thought?
The characterization, on the other hand, is really spot on. Each character has a very well-defined personality. One of the most important characters, the Cleaner, is even voiced by Paul Haddad, the voice of Leon S. Kennedy in the original Resident Evil 2, in what has been his last role before sadly passing away on April 2020. If you want to know more about his life and career, you can check out my tribute video. The link is displaying right now on your screen, and you can also find it in the description. For the most part, the characters are not your typical heroes, and while it's difficult to sympathize with all of them at first, they definitely are interesting. The whole plot is not your typical horror plot either, like heroes versus villains, and aside from the classic virus cliché, I felt it was very original and makes you want to know how it will all end up. Samuel, at least in the beginning, is probably the most aligned to the typical good hero character, and he is also easily relatable because of his condition that impacts the gameplay due to his recurring hallucinations.
Don't worry about a thing.
Speaking of the game mechanics, there is one in particular that sets this game apart, not only from the other survival horrors, but from action games in general. So, whenever you need to reload your gun, you don't automatically combine ammos, nor do they go directly to your magazines. That needs to be done manually through a menu. While sometimes I wish this was done the old way, automatically, it's certainly more realistic. But that's not just it. The gun's reload system is incredibly clever, because it forces you to think strategically, even in moments of tension.
How do you mean?
The way it works is that there are two different ways to reload your weapon. The classic reload that is slow and allows you to swap your current mag with another one that has more bullet in it, while also keeping the other magazine that you just discarded. And you do it by keeping the reload button pressed, which is not always easy when you're surrounded by enemies. The other method is quicker and easier during enemies encounters. When quick reloading, instead of keeping the discarded magazine, the character will simply throw it on the ground, for an indeed faster reload, but at the cost of then having to take the magazine back from where you've thrown it, if the situation allows it. While sometimes I curse this reloading method during the most frantic encounters, I can't help but wondering how come nobody thought of that before. I really love it, especially because it forces me to prepare myself in advance for future encounters. I think it's an innovative feature that perfectly fits into the spirit of the genre. At the same time, I can understand that this can turn off some people who don't love item management too much, because again, you don't just pick ammos, but also magazines, with each taking a full inventory slot, and that then needs to be filled manually with the ammos you found around.
Are we clear?
Moreover, when you open your inventory, the game doesn't pause, unlike most of the other survival horrors. It's realistic and tense, but I understand if this reloading system can feel cumbersome to some players.
Sorry.
Controls are good and responsive, well, except when they aren't. What I mean is that this game suffers of what I call the Order 1886 syndrome, meaning forced, slow walks for plot development. Sometimes you will receive some communications through radio that slow you to a literal crawl while keeping the gameplay active. So the enemy will move at the same speed as usual, while you will be busy listening to your pal's radio and getting hurt. This wouldn't be so much of an issue if it didn't sometimes happen during fights indeed, forcing you to slowly walk when all you wanted to do was just running away.
We have a problem of some magnitude here!
Thankfully, this doesn't happen all the time, or at least not too frequently when the enemies are around. On the other hand, enemy placement perfectly complements the level design. For example, you might get ambushed by some enemies, but you almost always have enough space to either retreat or go around them. Maybe not all of them. This is when you have to decide which ones to avoid and which not, also depending on your resources available at the moment. Does it remind you of something? Yes. It is just like the old Resident Evil games.
But I don't think it was accidental.
The puzzles, another fundamental mechanic in any survival horror, are one of the best parts in the game. They are numerous, tough, and very frequent, more than I remember them to be in the classic survival horror. And most importantly, they're not just about keys and locked doors. They're more like real riddles. While they're not always well placed, in my opinion, they're all very interesting. I would have just avoided to start the game with one. That's right. Even before meeting your first enemy, you will actually need to solve a puzzle. Very simple, to be fair. But that's just a weird choice of pace, in my opinion. But also very brave. It tells you straight away and in the face that the game is not afraid to throw you some puzzles, and among the toughest ones I've ever seen. So tough that I feel there is an actual chance of them blocking the most impatient players. While I can't really reproach the developers for trying to make the players use their brain, sometimes I feel that some clues could have been outlined a little better. I'm looking at you, Greek puzzle.
Nah, you're right.
Another huge positive to this game is that it doesn't excessively rely on jump scares that are usually few and far between. No, it relies on atmosphere, and one big contributor is the excellent soundtrack. It is clearly influenced by the great classic horror movies, especially the Italian ones, like all the movies from director Dario Argento. It really does wonders to enhance the experience. There is nothing worse when you're surrounded by zombies and then a monotone music kicks in, making you feel even more uncomfortable than before, only for then starting a new, more calm and melodic music to reflect the relief of reaching a safer area. It also knows when to stay quiet and let the ambient noises do the job. It is certainly not invasive, just like a good horror movie should be. To me, this old soundtrack stands among the best of the genre, and it even found itself in heavy rotation on my Spotify. But I already know what you want to know. You want to know if one of the staples in the whole survival horror universe has been preserved. Is the voice acting bad? Yes, it is.
Talk about what? Sweetie?
But entertainingly so.
Hang on a minute.
It made me chuckle more than once, and the whole game has the same B-movie feel to it, again, just like its source material, to which it intends paying tribute.
You're right.
But Daymare 1998 doesn't stop there. It is full of great direct and subtle references and Easter eggs to the whole horror culture. And beyond, it extends its range of tributes also to the whole 90s and 80s, 360 degrees, movies, TV series, books, and of course, also other video games. My favorite must be the Half-Life reference, which I won't spoil here because you need to see it for yourself.
Sorry, bud. Orders are orders.
As you can see, there are a few hiccups, some genius touches, but in general, Daymare 1998 is a very well-crafted game. It is clearly aimed for an audience of fans growing playing Resident Evil, Silent Hill, with the puzzle difficulty turned to max, and other survival horrors from the 90s and early 2000s. The result is fantastic, especially for an indie title sold at a budget price. Considering that the game takes around 6 to 7 hours to complete, you get your money's worth. True, once you finish the game on normal, there is not much more to do aside from taking on the Daymare difficulty and go after some collectibles. It might have some small flaws, but the few things that don't work stand out only because the overall experience works so well. It wanted to feel nostalgic, not old.
What are you getting at?
How should I explain it?
Daymare 1998 is much more than the sum of its single parts. While there are certainly margins of improvement, what these guys have built so far is an incredibly solid base for the future, but with an eye to the past. To the point that the game even got a sequel, or rather, a prequel, Daymare 1994. And I might even take a look at it in the future. Write me a comment if you wish me to do so. As for Daymare 1998 though, it's a pretty good horror experience that expertly mixes the modernity of more recent survival horror with the nostalgic atmosphere of the first Resident Evil games, with a sprinkle of experimentation with its gameplay to give it its own identity. And I think it's a criminally underrated game, a legit indie hidden gem, and you shouldn't miss it.
Yeah, well, I ain't.
So if now your zombie flesh is itching, it might be because you need to, once again, enter the world of survival horror. And Daymare 1998 is one hell of a time machine. The Nintendo 3DS is a fantastic console that offers a unique spin on the 3D technology. There are many great games too, with your Super Mario 3D Land, Metroid Samus Returns, the Zelda games. There's enough to make anyone happy. But you wouldn't consider it a good fit for the horror genre. And you would be wrong, because there are quite a few horror games for our little 3DS. But among more well-known horror titles like Resident Evil Revelations and Spirit Camera, there is this awesome indie hidden gem called Creeping Terror, which, by the way, is also available on PC through Steam. But more on that later. I've always been a big fan of the first Clock Tower, or 2D horror games in general, like Lone Survivor or Home. So when I've heard of Creeping Terror, I wanted it immediately. And I didn't come away disappointed. Just like with Clock Tower, you can't really fight your enemies, but only avoid them or stall them a little.
We're so lucky to live in a mansion like this.
The graphics show detailed 2D sprites on a 3D environment, mixing them in a 2.5D style of gameplay. The 3D effect is also put to good use, but rather to use it to make things pop out of the screen, it instead helps to give further depth to the polygonal environment. The ambient soundscape is also very good, and perfectly complements the oppressive atmosphere of the game. Unlike Clock Tower though, and thankfully I might add, you have direct control over your character. The game loop is typical of survival horror, with search for the next key item, escaping the various pursuers, and triggering the next story cutscene. The story sees a group of teenagers that wants to make a short movie inside a haunted mansion in order to share it online, and we take control of Arisa, a girl from said group. Even though the story is quite cliché, the background story is very well explained through environmental storytelling and text files.
I think it's really creepy.
Speaking of environments, all the classics are there, from the mansion to the hospital, passing through the creepy forest, and they're all extremely atmospheric, also thanks to the excellent care put in the lighting effects, in particular for the flashlight. You can choose to hide from enemies or to throw an item to stun them so that you can run past by them.
Oh, you're scared, aren't you?
The game also has limited inventory, but only for resources, like health packs or throwable items to stun the pursuers. Key items are stored separately and have no limit on how many you can carry. I love this, as it makes the gameplay experience much smoother. Arisa also has a life bar, which is also the stamina meter, that decreases when running from enemies, but it doesn't decrease at all during regular exploration, which again denotes a certain care from the developers in trying to make the gameplay experience as smooth as possible, which it is, especially by survival horror standards. While the longevity is a little bit on the short side, the game has multiple endings, which work wonders for increasing the amount of hours you can spend with Creeping Terror. Honestly, if the first Clock Tower ever gets a remake, and I mean a proper remake, not simply a port or a remaster, I would be happy if it was done in the same style as Creeping Terror, as I am fully satisfied both graphically and from a gameplay perspective. This to me is the pure definition of a hidden gem, so yes, this one is undeservingly not nearly talked about enough. Unfortunately, it didn't get a physical release, but to end on a good note, you can also play it on PC via Steam, even though apparently it's just a poor port of the 3DS version, even keeping the dual screen. Well, at least it's one more way to play it, and you should definitely play it.
Where am I?
Song of Horror is an old-school adventure that comes with fixed camera style, eerie atmosphere, and tons of puzzles and riddles. So yeah, I want to make this clear. This is not a survival horror.
Oh, you're joking.
It's a horror game. A horror adventure with supernatural enemies and a very dark atmosphere, but no survival elements whatsoever. There is no direct combat here. You can't kill enemies. There are no weapons, no bullet, and no ink ribbons to save your progress manually. More on that later. In other words, there is no resource management here, which is an essential component of the survival horror games. The only real items you get are those related to puzzles, but even in that case, there is very little to manage, since you don't even have a limited inventory space, which can be a good thing depending on whom you ask. And it's not like you can't defend yourself either, as of course there are ways out of enemies' grasp. And it makes sense that there are no real weapons because the protagonists of the story are everyday men and women. Song of Horror was initially released on PC via Steam in an episodic format. While I'm not normally a fan of this way of releasing games, players on consoles will have the complete edition. Of course, the game will keep its episodic nature, and while this can result in a somewhat fragmented narration, at the same time, this really helps the variety, as we will soon see.
I'd better take a look.
We follow the misadventures of the many characters that are investigating the disappearance of the Husher family. It all started with the vanishing of acclaimed writer Sebastian P. Husher and that of his family. Whoever tries and investigates about this mysterious chain of events is also taken by the horrifying and omnipresent creature simply known as the Presence. Now, I'm admittedly making things very simple here because I want to avoid as many spoilers as I can. Just a word of warning: when you start playing, the story starts pretty slowly, but it gets way better passing the second episode, and actually leads to one of the best endings I've seen in a classic horror title.
It ends like this?
So whenever you feel it starts dragging on a little bit, keep pushing because it's really rewarding later on. This title has actually many aces up its sleeves to keep you hooked, and are mostly related to the peculiar insertion of some roguelike elements in this typical horror context. First, the Presence will make sure that events can change dynamically throughout the episodes, so that each playthrough feels at least somewhat different. More on that later. Another unique aspect is the permadeath.
How could I possibly explain something like this?
You see, there are more than 10 playable characters in this game, and whenever one dies, it stays dead. But you can still keep on playing with the rest of the characters. The only exception is Daniel, the protagonist, whose death means the restart of the episode, even if there are other characters left alive.
Oh, crikey, seriously?
Each episode will present a different set of protagonists, including some returning ones from previous episodes, if they manage to survive. There is even a mechanic that allows you to collect once again all the items that your previously fallen character left when he or she died. While in a proper roguelike game, retrieving the previously lost items is not essential to progress through the game, after all it's usually just loot. In this case, it actually is essential, because the items left are usually key items. I must admit that I'm not normally a fan of this kind of mechanics, but if there is one genre where it actually makes a lot of sense to have it, this is certainly the horror genre. In fact, even the original survival horror, the legendary Sweet Home for the Famicom, the precursor to the Resident Evil games also developed by Capcom, had a pretty similar permadeath mechanic. Anyway, for people who see this as a deal breaker, just know that you can turn this off, even though the developers literally beg you not to do it.
Very funny.
But it makes sense, as this game was balanced completely around this permadeath mechanic. But it's really good that they still left the option to turning it off for those who really can't stand it, but still want to play the game. And again, I think it makes sense in this horror context, as it adds immensely to the tension.
We had no idea how serious the situation was.
The only thing I can complain about is that some deaths seem really cheap. Especially in cases in which you're actually given the option of doing something that might seem stupid, but the curiosity to see the results is so much that you might end up doing it and losing a character for that inconsiderate gesture. After all, we gamers have always been taught to interact with anything, so this goes against every instinct in gaming. But that's the geniality of it. You need to be careful in this horror game, just as if you were in a real horror situation. But yeah, if you're curious like a cat, I suggest you to simply do a playthrough with the permadeath turned off, but only after you've completed the game at least once. Especially because once you get to know the characters, you will grow attached to them, and the fact that they can die permanently takes its weight, because, well, you will never see them again. It also helps that each one of them has different stats, including the usuals like speed, strength, but also weird ones like serenity that basically tells you how easily a character can get scared in front of danger. Pretty interesting. In what I feel is a direct consequence of the permadeath mechanic, you can only save when you need to exit the game. But at least you can save anywhere, as long as it's in a safe situation.
This could be useful.
If all characters available in that episode die, then you will have to restart the whole episode. Which is something that actually happened to me, and I felt very frustrated in the beginning. But I soon realized that once you already learned through experience where all the key items are located and where to use them, it doesn't take that long to reach the same level of progress as before. On top of that, the procedural nature of the attacks and jump scares make sure that the experience will stay fresh enough even after repeated playthrough with different characters.
Burn in hell, demon.
Another thing in which this game decides to go a different way is in the complete lack of tank controls, which is in odd contrast with the type of audience that the developers are aiming for, the same players that grew up with the old-style tank controls-driven horror games. Yes, in Song of Horror you can only use the 3D control method, for which the character will go in the direction you push your left analog stick to instead of up, always moving forward. Whichever school you belong to, it would have been nice to have the option, and I can understand the reasoning behind their exclusion in a way, as modern gamers love to bash them.
That's disgusting.
But it still feels incoherent to make a traditional old-school horror game aimed at old-school horror fans and not having at least the option of using tank controls. The best way is like the Resident Evil remake and Zero HD remasters, where they keep the tank controls with the D-pad and leave the 3D movement to the analog stick. This way you can literally switch on the fly depending on the situation.
I'm well aware.
Well, anyway, those who prefer a more modern control scheme will feel good about it. And admittedly, I'd rather have full control of the characters in moments of danger. But during exploration, you might probably make more than one hard turn when the camera changes suddenly from one angle to the other. There are also other things that this game does differently. Sometimes the presence might want to attack you and burst into the room you're in. In cases like this, you will have to go against any instinct of hiding or escaping and face the fear in the eyes, or rather, through the door. In fact, there is the interesting mechanic that basically allows your character to stay behind the door and keep pushing it against the enemy so that it doesn't come through. Admittedly, this can grow tiring after a while of doing this because it requires button mashing to a certain degree. But it's not mindless, as you really need to pay attention at when you need to alternate the tapping of buttons, making it a fairly tense experience.
Jesus, Mary and Joseph.
So yeah, overall I approve this, especially because when the enemy stops pushing the door against me, the sigh of relief coming from finally being able to stop mashing buttons also coincide with the sigh of relief of being safe. But yeah, I have to admit that this mechanic can get to people's nerves on the long run, so it's something to keep in mind. To prevent entering a room that has a presence in it, you can always listen closely behind the door to detect possible enemies on the other side. If you are careless and ignore this mechanic, you might end up dead just when you least expect it. And while again this can grow tiresome after some time, considering that there is permadeath in this game, it actually helps the immersion.
You had us all on tenterhooks.
To play Song of Horror the right way, I feel you need to put yourself in your character's shoes. If your life depended on a wrong move, wouldn't you be actually listening to almost each and every door before passing through? And it's not that bad anyway, because it doesn't happen to every single door, and the atmosphere is so tense that you will want to listen to each door when you have the chance to make sure you won't jump into the dark and get killed in an instant. Speaking of dark, the flashlight here has some peculiarities too. Your light source, whether it be an actual flashlight or a candle, depending on the character you play as, can be pointed at any direction you want by using the right analog stick. This actually reminded me more of the 4th episode of the Alone in the Dark series, called The New Nightmare. That too allowed you to point your light in different directions, allowing items to glow and be highlighted. It's more or less the same here, but in some of horror items can be interacted only when the light has been pointed directly at them. On top of that, just like Alone in the Dark, the new Nightmare, and unlike more modern horror games, the flashlight here can be used without any limitations, so no batteries or matches needed.
It would terrify me to be here, alone in the dark.
If you think this is a positive aspect or not, it will depend on your way of seeing things. It can be detrimental to the tension that the developers clearly aim to create, but at the same time, it can spare you many frustrating moments in the dark, having to backtrack to find batteries or matches. I personally see it as a positive, as there is already enough backtracking in relation to the puzzles. But the flashlight not only does have a practical use, but it also contributes immensely to the atmosphere.
This place gives me the creeps.
Come to think of it, the atmosphere is probably the best aspect of the game, certainly my favorite. The environment feels dark and alive, it all has a certain Lovecraftian mood. And clearly Lovecraft has been a huge inspiration for the team at Protocol Games, and they certainly did no effort in trying to hide it. And why should they? Even the difficulty selection screen sees Lovecraft's name along with other illustrious writers like Edgar Allan Poe as the main options. There is even an option to adjust the size of the on-screen text, which, if you have been following my channel long enough, you know is something I love to see, because I strongly believe that the font size used in today's games is often way too small. Or is it just me? Am I just old? I guess I am. And there will be a lot of reading too, because in typical horror games fashion, there's a ton of documents hanging around and tons of stuff to examine, which will trigger the usual descriptive message at the bottom of the screen. I just wish the movement input didn't instantly delete those messages, because I often don't have enough time to read them, and I'm usually pressing the analog stick for moving around, so, well, minor nitpick really, but still.
I'm sorry.
The actual script is very elegantly written and further confirms the huge influence that the classic horror writers had on the developers.
Again. Another Friday evening and I'm working as an errand boy. I suppose they're too important over at Wake Publishers to come looking for jolly old Husher themselves.
This is also seen in the architecture of the location you will visit, which can be pretty intricate at times. We will be able to explore many of the classic staples of the genre, including a mansion, a hospital, but also a university and many more.
So that seemed like a good place to start.
This really helps push the variety, which is something the genre usually lacks, but also keeps a little bit of backtracking, another staple of the genre, because each episode has its own location and set of places which will need to be revisited way more than once and will keep you quite busy. I'm also glad to see that each point of interaction is discreetly highlighted by a white dot, making it feel more like a point-and-click adventure game, but at least this way you won't need to spend hours in trial and error like in the old days. And in worst-case scenarios in which you find yourself lost, you can always consult the handy map that marks each time you encounter an important element of the numerous puzzles you will find throughout.
It may be worth taking a peek too.
Speaking of puzzles, they really are numerous and well thought out. And there's even more quality of life improvements in this department. You see, in some cases, once you manage to find a document related to a specific puzzle, you will be able to access it right in the middle of the puzzle itself through a simple press of a button.
My life depended on it.
Whereas in most other games, you usually need to go out of the puzzle screen and reach the document screen to consult it, wasting precious time, and it feels quite unhandy to be honest. So that's one more plus. What I think is not a plus is that sometimes there are roadblocks that have no justification whatsoever to exist, other than to make sure you do everything in the order the developers wanted. Like there is an example of this right at the beginning of the game. I'd like to go upstairs here, but the character I'm playing as tells me, nah, it's better if I keep on searching downstairs first.
I should take a look on this floor first.
And I'm like, why? There's literally no physical obstacle preventing me from going upstairs other than the character I'm supposed to be in full control of telling me that he or she doesn't feel like it.
Come on, man.
I think this is kind of lazy, and it could have been done better. Like, even just a supernatural black fog, like the presence itself, would have been better than just having my character telling me what to do, or in this case what not to do, when I'm the one supposed to be in control.
No, the music isn't coming from upstairs.
Speaking of characters, while they clearly didn't receive the same attention to details as the environment, they still are pretty decent looking, and their animations are really well done. Each movement feels fluid and almost hypnotic. Most important cutscenes, mostly the ones transitioning from one episode to the next, are done in a different style, which I think is a clever way to get around the small budget. And that's a good idea, as they look really nice and artistic, and at the same time I'm sure that the team at Protocol Games had probably saved a few bucks in time during the development process. And considering the independent nature of the game, I think they made the right call by prioritizing the atmosphere through the incredibly well-crafted environments rather than focusing too much on making the character models look perfect. One aspect that clearly shines in this production is the monster design, as they are really some nasty creatures, among the most horrifying I've ever seen in a video game. Won't spoil them all here, but surely hats off to the developers for imagining such nightmares that perfectly complemented the atmosphere of the game and are among the main reasons for which this game can get really tense. We're talking hair-raiser level of monstrosity here.
How dare you use that word?
If only they had more time in the spotlight. In fact, the only thing that might turn some people off is the fighting system, or rather, lack thereof. You see, when the enemies appear, you can't really interact with them. They don't chase you around in the environment. They simply trigger a minigame. Very tense, to be fair, again, like everything else in this game. So yeah, if you were hoping to have a more classic fighting system, you will be disappointed. And the same if you were hoping to see enemies wandering around on the field, like Outlast and Amnesia. This is also more coherent with the Lovecraftian influence, where the monsters are rarely seen, but their presence felt throughout.
What is this?
From a gameplay perspective, I can understand why it was done this way. Imagine a stealth game with fixed camera angles. It simply wouldn't work that well. So yeah, overall I think the developers did the best they could to balance the weaponless gameplay with the monster encounters. And it works. For example, many times we need to hide around or stand still in front of a blind enemy and trying to maintain calm through a very clever use of quick-time events, in which if you lose focus, the rhythm at which you need to press the buttons will get more erratic and harder to manage. So yeah, congrats to Protocol Games for actually making clever use of something as hated as quick-time events. I just wish there were more direct encounters with the monsters, simply because they are so scary. But more than what you can see, sometimes is what you can't see that can take you off guard. And indeed, I feel that the true star is the presence itself. Taking from the best pages of cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft, the developers shaped the presence to be a threatening and invisible foe, which will throw at you everything it got, from jump scares related to the environment to the aforementioned nasty creatures. But the presence is also much more than that. It is also procedural AI that dynamically changes the level of threats that will throw at you depending on the way you play. Passing off into the same room, boom, the presence will attack you at your 15th time visiting said room. Did your character die because of a door you couldn't manage to hold and the presence snatched you? You bet there will be more of them until you manage to overcome your nerves.
I can barely distinguish what's real from what's not.
And of course, random jump scares will make sure you're always on edge. But the best part is that they're not telegraphed and are mostly related to the environment, and most importantly, they do not play a loud noise when they happen, which is something that usually annoys me a lot when it happens in movies. In fewer words, the presence will make sure that you never feel truly safe, thanks to the unpredictability of these events.
My lord, the darkness is coming.
This also makes backtracking less of a chore and more of a tense experience, and since the game relies a lot on puzzles and key items, backtracking will be something that you will do frequently. But it will also allow you to appreciate the ton of details which really help the immersion, like the fact that you can see the dust particles floating in the air when you point the flashlight in a specific direction, or the way the characters change the hand holding the flashlight in order to open a door more naturally. It's this kind of level of details that can make a difference in a context like this. However, part of this is ruined by some of the weirdest graphical glitches I've seen, like this one. They're not really that common, to be fair, but when they happen, they can really put you out of the experience. Which is a pity because, again, technically this isn't a bad game. And while some loadings can last quite a little, especially in the beginning, once you're in the game, there is hardly ever any loading, so that you can focus on exploring and, well, staying alive for as long as possible.
Thank God it stopped.
Speaking of longevity, each episode can be completed in roughly 3 to 4 hours, depending on your skill, so it actually has a very decent longevity overall. Also, there's a huge replayability factor in Song of Horror, which will make completionists very happy, as they try and do the perfect run with all characters alive.
Oh my god, they're all dead.
At the same time, the presence AI will make sure that no playthrough is exactly the same as the last. From the sound department, the music is pretty good, with delicate but eerie ambient tunes that set the mood, and some sinister soundscapes to send chills down your spine. And the sudden sounds that tend to scare you are not loud enough to be a nuisance, but certainly do keep you on edge, especially because your character will react accordingly, and it's always fascinating to see. It really helps to strengthen the bond between you and your avatar. The voice acting is also pretty decent overall, even if some performances are better than others admittedly. But it all comes together well to complement the graphics and hugely contributes to create the most unnerving experience.
Sorry, who is this? I can't understand you.
We can't leave my room.
What the?
Song of Horror is a rough gem. The few flaws, such as over-reliance on quick-time events and some admittedly lame and forced roadblocks during exploration, can easily be forgiven by horror fanatics who've grown up with the likes of Alone in the Dark, Silent Hill, and the early Resident Evil games. It does enough things right and differently to feel fresh in some ways, while also staying true to the cult classics of the genre. With a selection of new old-school horror games with fixed camera angles growing thinner than ever, Song of Horror is definitely one you don't want to miss if you're a fanatic of the genre. But this is just one guy's opinion on the internet, so now I want to know yours down in the comments. Did you play any of these games? What did you think of them? Share your thoughts in the comment section down below. Personally, these games might be rough around the edges. We're still talking about indie games, not AAA productions. They certainly helped in keeping the old-school survival horror genre alive, and I'm glad that there are still some developers out there brave enough to bring the old-school horror philosophy to today's difficult gaming market. Kudos to them, true heroes. But this really wraps it up. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. This way you will always be up to speed with my latest videos, and you will also help a fellow gamer out to bring you the best quality content. For you it's just the push of a few buttons, but for me it truly does make a difference. But really, I just want to thank you so much for spending some of your precious time watching this video to the end. I will be seeing you in my next one, but until then, stay safe, play safe, world gamers.